A black girl named Juliet calls her father in tears, saying the cop did it again, after being wrongfully detained on her way home. What her father does next is unbelievable. How far will he go to make sure those responsible face the consequences? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Juliet bounced along the sidewalk, her backpack swinging with each step. The warm sun kissed her cheeks as she held her new phone close to her heart. It was more than just a gadget. It was a symbol of her hard work and dedication at school. "I can't wait to show Dad," she whispered to herself, her brown eyes sparkling with joy. The streets of her neighborhood were familiar and comforting. Mrs. Johnson waved from her porch, and old Mr. Peters was tending to his roses. Juliet's world felt safe and full of promise. But not everyone saw the world through Juliet's innocent eyes. Officer Daniels sat in his patrol car, his gaze fixed on the young girl walking down the street. His mind raced with assumptions, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the shiny new phone in her hands. "No way a kid from this neighborhood could afford that," he muttered, his prejudices clouding his judgment. Without a second thought, Officer Daniels stepped out of his car. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud, and he adjusted his belt as he approached Juliet. Juliet's smile faded as she noticed the stern-faced officer walking towards her. Her heart began to race, and she clutched her phone tighter. "Hey, you!" Officer Daniels called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Where'd you get that phone?" Juliet froze, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. The once friendly neighborhood suddenly felt cold and threatening. I, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Daniels loomed over her, his shadow casting a dark pall on the sidewalk. "I asked you a question, young lady. Where did you get that phone?" Juliet's lower lip trembled as she looked up at the officer. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. The joy of her achievement was quickly replaced by a feeling of shame and fear she didn't understand. It's mine," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "My dad gave it to me for my good grades." Officer Daniels scoffed, clearly not believing her. "Sure he did. Why don't you come with me, and we'll sort this out at the station?" Juliet's world was crumbling around her. She didn't understand why this was happening or what she had done wrong. All she knew was that she wanted her dad, and she wanted to go home. Juliet's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to explain herself to Officer Daniels. Her voice quivered, barely above a whisper. "Please, sir, I'm telling the truth. My dad gave it to me for getting good grades." But Officer Daniels wasn't listening. His face hardened, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "Stop lying, girl. Kids like you don't just get expensive phones." Tears welled up in Juliet's eyes. She didn't understand what he meant by "kids like you," but it made her feel small and ashamed. Without warning, Officer Daniels reached out and snatched the phone from Juliet's trembling hands. "This is evidence now," he growled. "No!" Juliet cried out, reaching for her precious gift. "Please, give it back." Her plea fell on deaf ears. Officer Daniels roughly grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. The pain made Juliet yelp, drawing the attention of people passing by. A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. Some watched with wide eyes, others whispered to each other, but no one stepped forward to help. Juliet looked around desperately, hoping someone would speak up for her, but all she saw were averted gazes and uncomfortable expressions. "You're under arrest for theft," Officer Daniels announced, his voice loud and harsh. Juliet felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. The reality of what was happening hit her like a wave, and she began to sob uncontrollably. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whimpered, but her words were lost in her tears. Officer Daniels roughly guided her towards his patrol car. Juliet's legs felt weak, and she stumbled, but the officer's grip on her arm kept her from falling. As he opened the back door of the car, Juliet caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear. "Get in," Officer Daniels ordered, pushing her into the back seat. As the door slammed shut, Juliet felt utterly powerless. The world outside the car window seemed to blur as her tears flowed freely. She had never felt so alone, so scared, so misunderstood. All she wanted was her dad, but he was nowhere to be seen. As the police car pulled away from the curb, Juliet sat in the back seat, her small frame shaking with each sob. The world outside the window became a blur of colors and shapes, much like her jumbled thoughts. Her mind raced, recalling moments from her past that suddenly took on a new, painful meaning. And she remembered the time at the grocery store when an elderly woman had clutched her purse tightly as Juliet walked by, or when her teacher had seemed surprised by her high test scores, asking if she had help at home. These memories, once brushed off as simple misunderstandings, now felt like puzzle pieces falling into place. But this was different. This wasn't just a look or a comment. This was real, scary, and happening right now. Juliet felt a heaviness in her chest, a weight she'd never experienced before. The police station loomed ahead, a large, intimidating building that made Juliet's heart race even faster. As Officer Daniels led her inside, she felt like all eyes were on her. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the voices too loud. Everything felt overwhelming. They stopped at a small room with a single table and 2 chairs. "Wait here," Officer Daniels said gruffly, closing the door behind him. Juliet stood there, unsure of what to do. Her wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, and her cheeks felt stiff from dried tears. A few minutes later, another officer came in and removed her handcuffs. "You're allowed 1 phone call," the officer said, pointing to a phone on the wall. With trembling hands, Juliet picked up the receiver. Her fingers shook as she dialed her father's number, a number she knew by heart. The phone rang once, twice, and then she heard her father's warm, familiar voice. "Hello?" At the sound of her dad's voice, Juliet's composure crumbled. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she choked out, "Dad, the cops did it again." Dr. Samuel's voice immediately changed, filled with concern and alarm. "Juliet? Sweetheart, what happened? Where are you?" Through her tears, Juliet managed to explain where she was. Her father's voice was steady and reassuring as he promised, "I'm coming right away, honey. Don't worry, everything will be okay." As Juliet hung up the phone, she felt a small flicker of hope. Her dad was coming. He would make things right. He always did. Dr. Samuel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped towards the police station. His heart raced, and a mixture of anger and fear coursed through his veins. The sound of Juliet's trembling voice on the phone echoed in his mind, fueling his determination. As he drove, memories of past incidents flashed before him like a painful slideshow. He remembered the time Juliet came home from school in tears because a classmate had made a racist comment. Then there was the day at the park when another parent had accused Juliet of bullying, despite her being the victim. Each memory stoked the fire of injustice burning inside him. "Not again," Dr. Samuel muttered, his jaw clenched. "Not my little girl. Not this time." He thought about all the times he'd had to comfort Juliet, to explain why people sometimes treated her differently. He'd always tried to shield her, to give her a normal childhood. But now, as he raced to her rescue once more, he realized that shielding her wasn't enough anymore. The familiar feeling of helplessness threatened to overwhelm him, but Dr. Samuel pushed it aside. This time would be different. He wouldn't let them brush this incident under the rug or make excuses. He was tired of the system failing his daughter, tired of having to pick up the pieces of her shattered confidence time and time again. As the police station came into view, Dr. Samuel took a deep breath. He parked his car and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts and steeling himself for what was to come. He knew he needed to remain calm and composed, but he also knew he wouldn't back down. Not this time. "I'm coming, Juliet," he whispered, his voice filled with determination. "And this time, we're going to make things right." With that, Dr. Samuel stepped out of his car and walked towards the station entrance, his steps purposeful and his resolve unshakable. Dr. Samuel burst through the police station doors, his normally calm demeanor replaced by a storm of barely contained fury. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of Juliet. The bustling station seemed to slow as heads turned to watch the man on a mission. He strode up to the front desk where a bored-looking officer sat shuffling papers. "I'm here to see my daughter Juliet," Dr. Samuel said, his voice tight with emotion. "She was wrongfully detained earlier today." The officer barely glanced up. "Fill out this form and wait your turn, sir." Dr. Samuel's fist came down on the desk, causing the officer to jump. "I will not wait. I demand to see my daughter now, and I want to speak with the officer responsible for her arrest." The dismissive attitude of the desk officer only fueled Dr. Samuel's anger. He raised his voice, drawing the attention of everyone in the station. "What reason did you have to detain a young girl walking home from school? What crime did she commit other than being black with a new phone?" His words echoed through the suddenly quiet room. Other officers glanced nervously at each other, sensing the growing tension. Dr. Samuel's eyes blazed with determination as he continued, "I want answers, and I want them now. Where is my daughter?" The desk officer, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to placate him. "Sir, please lower your voice. We have procedures." "Procedures?" Dr. Samuel cut him off. "Is it procedure to handcuff an innocent child? To traumatize her for no reason?" His voice grew louder with each question, filling the station with his righteous indignation. As the confrontation escalated, more officers gathered nearby, unsure of how to handle the situation. The air in the station grew thick with tension, everyone acutely aware of the powder keg Dr. Samuel's fury had ignited. As Dr. Samuel was led to a small room, his heart raced with anticipation and worry. The moment he saw Juliet, his anger melted into concern. She sat hunched in a chair, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Her usually bright smile was replaced by a look of fear and confusion. "Juliet!" he exclaimed, rushing to her side. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. "It's okay, baby. Daddy's here now." Juliet clung to him, her small frame shaking as she sobbed into his chest. Dr. Samuel stroked her hair, whispering words of comfort. "Shh, it's all right. You're safe now. I've got you." As he held his daughter, Dr. Samuel's mind raced. He silently vowed to make things right, to ensure that this injustice would not go unanswered. But for now, his priority was Juliet. Slowly, Juliet's sobs subsided. She looked up at her father, her voice trembling as she began to recount what had happened. "I was just walking home, Dad. Officer Daniels, he thought I stole the phone you gave me. He wouldn't listen. He just grabbed me and..." With each word, Dr. Samuel felt his rage building again. The thought of his innocent daughter being treated like a criminal made his blood boil. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for Juliet's sake. "It's not your fault, sweetheart," he assured her. "You did nothing wrong. I'm going to make this right." Dr. Samuel stood up, his jaw set with determination. He turned to the officer who had escorted him to the room. "I want to speak with Officer Daniels. Now." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I'm not sure if that's possible right now." "It wasn't a request," Dr. Samuel interrupted, his voice firm. "I demand to meet the officer who falsely accused my daughter. I won't leave until I do." The officer hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll see what I can do. Please wait here." As they waited, Dr. Samuel held Juliet close, his mind already formulating how he would confront Officer Daniels. He knew this meeting could change everything, and he was prepared to fight for justice with every ounce of his being. Officer Daniels sauntered into the room, his face a mask of indifference. He barely glanced at Juliet, who shrank back in her chair at the sight of him. Dr. Samuel stood up, his eyes blazing with righteous anger as he faced the man who had wronged his daughter. "Officer Daniels," Dr. Samuel said, his voice low and controlled, "I'd like you to explain why you arrested my daughter." Officer Daniels shrugged, his casual demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "She fit the description of a suspect we were looking for. Just doing my job, sir." Dr. Samuel's jaw clenched. He took a step closer to Officer Daniels, his voice sharp as he spoke. "A suspect? My daughter was walking home from school with a phone I gave her as a reward. How does that fit any description of a criminal?" "Look, these things happen," Officer Daniels said dismissively. We got a call about a stolen phone and your daughter matched the description. It's standard procedure." "Standard procedure?" Dr. Samuel's voice rose. "To handcuff a child without even listening to her explanation? To traumatize her for simply existing in her own neighborhood?" Officer Daniels crossed his arms, his stance defensive. "Now, let's not blow this out of proportion. We're just doing our job to keep the community safe." "Safe?" Dr. Samuel scoffed. "You call this safe? Terrorizing innocent children based on nothing but your own biases?" As Dr. Samuel continued to press him, Officer Daniels remained unmoved, brushing off each accusation with practiced ease. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but—" "No, you don't understand," Dr. Samuel cut him off. "You don't understand what it's like to live in fear that your child might be harmed by the very people sworn to protect her. You don't understand the pain of having to explain to your daughter why she's treated differently because of the color of her skin." As the confrontation between Dr. Samuel and Officer Daniels escalated, the door to the room swung open. A tall, imposing figure stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. It was Captain Edwards, the police chief. Dr. Samuel's eyes widened in surprise. He recognized the man instantly. It was his old best friend from a decade ago. For a brief moment, the tension in the room shifted as their eyes met, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "Sam?" Captain Edwards said, his voice a mix of surprise and concern. Dr. Samuel nodded but quickly refocused on the matter at hand. "John, I wish we were reuniting under better circumstances," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "But right now, I need you to listen to what's happened to my daughter." Captain Edwards looked from Dr. Samuel to Juliet, who sat quietly in her chair, her eyes red from crying. "Of course, Sam. Tell me what's going on." Dr. Samuel took a deep breath and began to explain. He recounted how Juliet had been wrongfully arrested, how Officer Daniels had profiled her based on nothing more than her appearance. As he spoke, his voice trembled with a mixture of anger and pain. "She was just walking home, John," Dr. Samuel said, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Walking home with a phone I gave her, and now she's traumatized, feeling like she can't even exist in her own neighborhood without being seen as a criminal." Captain Edwards listened intently, his face growing more troubled with each word. He glanced at Officer Daniels, who stood off to the side, looking uncomfortable but still defiant. "This isn't right, Sam," Captain Edwards said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "I promise you, I'll look into this matter personally. We'll get to the bottom of what happened here." He turned to Officer Daniels, his expression stern. "Officer, I want a full report on my desk within the hour. We'll discuss this further." Looking back at Dr. Samuel and Juliet, Captain Edwards' face softened. "I'm sorry this happened to you, Juliet. We'll do everything we can to make this right." Captain Edwards listened intently as Dr. Samuel recounted Juliet's experience, his face growing more troubled with each detail. The pain in his old friend's voice was evident, and Edwards couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for the actions of his officer. When Dr. Samuel finished, Edwards turned to Officer Daniels. "Officer, what's your side of the story?" Officer Daniels straightened up, his jaw set. "Sir, I observed a young person with a new phone in an area where we've had recent thefts. I approached to investigate, and the suspect became agitated." "The suspect?" Dr. Samuel interrupted, his voice sharp. "She's a child, walking home from school." Captain Edwards held up a hand, silencing both men. He took a deep breath, his eyes moving from Dr. Samuel to Officer Daniels, and finally resting on Juliet, who sat quietly, her eyes downcast. "This situation is completely unacceptable," Edwards said firmly. "We cannot have our officers making assumptions based on appearance. It goes against everything we stand for." He turned to Juliet, his voice softening. "Juliet, I want to personally apologize for what you've been through today. No child should ever feel unsafe in their own neighborhood." Juliet looked up, her eyes meeting the captain's. She nodded slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Edwards continued, addressing the room. "We need to resolve this. not just for Juliet's sake, but for our community. Captain Edwards then asked Juliet's side. Juliet took a deep breath, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. With a gentle nod from her father, she began to speak, her voice quiet but steady. "I was just walking home from school," she said, her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. "I was so happy because Dad had given me this new phone for getting good grades. Then Officer Daniels came up to me." As Juliet recounted the events, her voice occasionally trembled, but she pushed through. She described the fear she felt when Officer Daniels approached her, the confusion when he accused her of theft, and the helplessness as she was handcuffed and put in the police car. Dr. Samuel's jaw clenched as he listened to his daughter's story, his eyes never leaving Officer Daniels. Captain Edwards leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concern. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As Juliet's words painted a vivid picture of her experience, something in his expression began to change. The defensiveness in his eyes slowly gave way to a flicker of understanding. When Juliet finished, Captain Edwards spoke softly. "Thank you for your bravery, Juliet. I want you to know that what happened to you today is not okay, and it will not be ignored." He turned to Officer Daniels, his voice firm. "Do you understand the impact of your actions now, officer?" Officer Daniels hesitated, then nodded slowly. I didn't realize," he began, but his words trailed off. Dr. Samuel leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "Didn't realize what, officer? That my daughter is a person? That she could be traumatized by your actions?" His voice was controlled, but the anger beneath was palpable. "You need to understand the full weight of what you've done today." Captain Edwards nodded in agreement. "Dr. Samuel is right. This goes beyond a simple mistake, Officer Daniels. We need to address the underlying biases that led to this situation." The tension in the room was thick as the four of them sat there. The confrontation set in motion, but the resolution still uncertain. Juliet looked from her father to Officer Daniels to Captain Edwards, her young face a mix of hope and apprehension. The path forward was unclear, but the first step had been taken. The tension in the room was palpable as Juliet finished her emotional retelling of the encounter. Officer Daniels remained silent, his eyes cast downward, but his discomfort was obvious. Dr. Samuel, feeling his daughter's pain, turned to face the officer, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and determination. "Well, Officer Daniels?" Dr. Samuel's voice was low but firm. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Officer Daniels shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "I was just following protocol," he said, his voice lacking conviction. "We had reports of stolen phones in the area, and I was doing my job." Dr. Samuel's fists clenched at his sides. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to traumatize innocent children." Captain Edwards leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He was acutely aware of the delicate balance he needed to strike between loyalty to his officers and justice for his old friend's daughter. "Officer Daniels," Captain Edwards said calmly, "can you walk us through your thought process? What specifically made you suspect Juliet?" Officer Daniels straightened his back, trying to regain his composure. "As I said, we had reports of stolen phones. I saw a young person with a new phone, and I made a judgment call." "A judgment call based on what?" Dr. Samuel interjected, his voice rising. "The color of her skin?" Officer Daniels flinched at the accusation. "That's not, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to what?" Dr. Samuel pressed. "To assume my daughter was a criminal just because she's black?" The room fell silent for a moment. Captain Edwards looked from Dr. Samuel to Officer Daniels, then to Juliet, who sat quietly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Officer Daniels," Captain Edwards said, breaking the silence, "I think we need to address the underlying assumptions that led to this situation. This goes beyond following protocol. We need to confront the biases that influenced your actions today." Dr. Samuel's frustration finally boiled over. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His eyes blazed with a fury that had been building since he first received Juliet's tearful call. "Protocol?" he spat, his voice rising. You call arresting without evidence an innocent child protocol? Since when is racial profiling part of police procedure? Officer Daniels flinched, his face a mixture of defensiveness and growing unease. Dr. Samuel took a step towards him, his finger pointing accusingly. You saw a young black girl with a new phone and immediately assumed she was a thief. That's not protocol, Officer Daniels. That's prejudice, plain and simple. The doctor's voice echoed through the small room, each word landing like a hammer blow. Juliet watched her father, her eyes wide with a mix of pride and anxiety. She had never seen him so angry, so passionate. Do you have any idea what you've done? Dr. Samuel continued, his voice breaking slightly. The trauma you've inflicted on my daughter, the message you've sent about her worth in this world. Officer Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Captain Edwards stood up, placing a hand on Dr. Samuel's shoulder. Sam, please, he said softly. I understand you're upset, but we need to calm down and… Calm down? Dr. Samuel whirled to face his old friend, shrugging off his hand. John, how can you ask me to calm down when my little girl was treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of her skin? He turned back to Officer Daniels, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. I want you to look at my daughter, Dr. Samuel demanded, his voice low and intense. Look at her and tell her why you thought it was okay to put her in handcuffs. Tell her why you assumed she was a thief. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Juliet sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching the scene unfold before her. She felt a strange mix of emotions, fear at the intensity of the confrontation, but also a swelling of love and gratitude for her father, who was fighting so fiercely on her behalf. Captain Edwards took a deep breath, his eyes darting between Dr. Samuel and Officer Daniels. The tension in the room was suffocating, and he knew he had to act quickly to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. All right, let's all take a moment here, he said, his voice calm but firm. He turned to Officer Daniels, his expression serious. Daniels, I need you to really think about what happened today. Put yourself in Juliet's shoes for a minute. How would you feel if someone accused you of theft without any real evidence? Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched. Sir, with all due respect, I was just doing my job. The girl was acting suspiciously. I had to investigate. Dr. Samuel's face reddened with anger. Suspiciously? He exploded. How exactly was she acting suspiciously? By walking home from school? By holding a phone that her father worked hard to buy for her? Captain Edwards held up a hand, trying to maintain order. Daniels, can you explain what specifically made Juliet's behavior seem suspicious to you? Officer Daniels straightened his back, his voice defensive. She was walking quickly, looking around nervously. It seemed like she might have been trying to avoid detection. Dr. Samuel let out a bitter laugh. Of course she was looking around nervously. She probably felt unsafe in her own neighborhood because of officers like you who see her as a threat instead of a child. This is textbook racial profiling, Dr. Samuel continued, his voice shaking with emotion. You saw a young black girl with a nice phone and immediately assumed she must have stolen it. Admit it, Daniels. Your actions were based on prejudice, not evidence. Juliet, who had been silent throughout the exchange, looked up at her father. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Slowly, she nodded her head, confirming her father's words. Officer Daniels' face flushed, but he remained stubborn. I was just following protocol. I didn't do anything wrong. Captain Edwards took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the tense faces in the room. He knew it was time for a different approach. With a heavy sigh, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. I think it's time I shared something with all of you, he began, his voice soft but steady. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. You see, I wasn't always the man I am today, Edwards continued, his gaze meeting Officer Daniels'. Early in my career, I held prejudices similar to what we're seeing here. I was shaped by my environment, by the experiences I had as a young cop on the streets. Dr. Samuel's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Juliet leaned in, her eyes wide with curiosity. Even Officer Daniels seemed taken aback by this unexpected turn. But something changed for me, Edwards said. a small smile tugging at his lips as he glanced at Dr. Samuel. And it all started with a friendship. He turned to face Dr. Samuel fully now. Sam, do you remember when we first met? I was a rookie cop, and you were just starting your residency at the hospital. Dr. Samuel nodded slowly, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Well, what you didn't know was that I came into that friendship with a lot of preconceived notions, Edwards admitted, his voice tinged with shame. But as I got to know you, as we shared meals and stories and dreams, something inside me began to shift. Edwards paused, his eyes misting over with the weight of his confession. You showed me that my assumptions were wrong. You challenged my beliefs without even knowing it. And over time, I realized that the prejudices I held were not just unfair, they were dangerous. Captain Edwards took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with emotion. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance as if looking back through time. There was a moment, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, that changed everything for me. The room fell silent, all eyes on the police chief as he continued his story. It was about a year into our friendship. I was working a late shift when I suddenly felt this crushing pain in my chest. Edwards placed a hand over his heart, reliving the memory. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I managed to radio for help before I collapsed. Dr. Samuel's eyes widened with recognition, remembering that fateful night. When I came to, I was in the ER, Edwards said, his voice growing stronger. And there you were, Sam, standing over me with that determined look in your eyes. He turned to face Dr. Samuel, a smile tugging at his lips. You saved my life that night, but it wasn't just your medical skills that made the difference. It was your compassion. Edward's gaze swept across the room, taking in the rapt attention of everyone present. Here I was, a white cop who'd held on to prejudices his whole life, and there you were, a black doctor, treating me with nothing but kindness and care. You didn't see my badge or my skin color, you just saw a person in need. His voice cracked slightly as he continued. That night changed me. It made me realize how wrong I'd been, how much damage those prejudices could do. I saw firsthand that the color of someone's skin doesn't define their character or their worth. Edwards turned to Officer Daniels, his expression serious. That experience taught me the importance of empathy and understanding in our line of work. We're here to protect and serve all people regardless of their race or background. Our job isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about building trust and respect in our community. The room fell into a heavy silence as Captain Edwards finished his story. Officer Daniels sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. The weight of the captain's words seemed to press down on him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his defensive posture began to crumble. Dr. Samuel watched Officer Daniels intently, searching for any sign that the message had gotten through. His anger still simmered beneath the surface, but he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point. Juliet, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, found herself studying the faces of the men in the room. She was still hurt and angry about what had happened to her, but as she watched the conversation unfold, she began to see the humanity in each of them. Her gaze lingered on Officer Daniels, noticing the conflict etched across his features. Captain Edwards leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm as he addressed Officer Daniels. We all have biases, Daniels. The important thing is recognizing them and working to overcome them. What happened today? It can't be undone, but it can be a catalyst for change. Officer Daniels lifted his head slowly, meeting the captain's gaze. His voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. I never thought about it like that, sir. I always believed I was just doing my job, keeping people safe. But now... He trailed off, his eyes darting to Juliet and then quickly away, shame evident in his expression. Dr. Samuel felt a mix of emotions as he watched Officer Daniels struggle with this realization. Part of him wanted to hold on to his anger, to demand immediate justice for Juliet, but another part of him recognized the importance of this moment, the potential for real change. Juliet, sensing the shift in the room, straightened in her chair. She looked at her father, then at Captain Edwards, before finally settling her gaze on Officer Daniels. Her voice was soft but steady when she spoke. "I was really scared today," she said, causing Officer Daniels to flinch visibly. "I didn't understand why you thought I was a thief. It hurt a lot." Her words hung in the air, raw and honest. Officer Daniels looked up, meeting Juliet's eyes for the first time. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Officer Daniels lowered his head, overwhelmed by the weight of his realizations. The room fell silent as he struggled to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. I'm sorry," he began, the words coming out hesitantly. "I never thought about how my actions could affect someone like this. Juliet, I didn't consider how scared and hurt you must have felt." He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "Dr. Samuel, I owe you an apology too. I put your daughter through something no child should ever experience. I was so caught up in what I thought was right, I didn't stop to think about the consequences." As Officer Daniels spoke, Dr. Samuel's expression remained stern. He appreciated the apology, but he knew all too well that words alone weren't enough. When Officer Daniels finished, Dr. Samuel leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I hear your apology, and I believe you mean it. But you need to understand something. It's not enough to just say you're sorry. Real change requires action." Dr. Samuel's words hung in the air, their impact visible on Officer Daniels' face. The police officer nodded slowly, understanding the truth in what Dr. Samuel was saying. "You're right," Officer Daniels admitted, his voice stronger now. "I need to do better, but I'm not sure where to start." Captain Edwards, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "That's where we come in, Daniels. We can work together to make sure this never happens again. Not to Juliet, not to anyone." Juliet, who had been listening intently, looked at her father. She saw the mixture of pain and hope in his eyes, and it made her feel both proud and sad at the same time. Captain Edwards leaned forward, his eyes filled with determination. He looked at Officer Daniels, who seemed lost and unsure of how to proceed. "Daniels," Edwards began, his voice firm but compassionate, "I think I know how we can move forward from this. It's clear that we need to address the root of the problem." Officer Daniels looked up, a mix of apprehension and hope on his face. "I'm suggesting that you undergo racial sensitivity and empathy training," Captain Edwards continued. "It's not just about learning facts, but about understanding people's experiences and perspectives." Dr. Samuel nodded in agreement, his expression softening slightly. Captain Edwards went on, "But that's not all. I want you to work with underprivileged communities. Spend time with them. Learn about their struggles firsthand. It's one thing to read about these issues, but it's another to see them up close." Officer Daniels swallowed hard but nodded. I think that would help," he said quietly. Dr. Samuel, seeing an opportunity to contribute, spoke up. "If I may add something," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's crucial that Officer Daniels engages with the community in a meaningful way. This isn't about ticking boxes or fulfilling requirements. It's about truly seeing the people he once judged unfairly in a new light." He turned to face Officer Daniels directly. "You need to listen to their stories, understand their fears and hopes. Only then can you begin to break down the barriers that led to this situation with my daughter." Juliet, who had been silent throughout this exchange, looked at her father with admiration. She saw the strength in his words, the way he was pushing for real change rather than just punishment. Officer Daniels took a deep breath, considering the suggestions. "I want to do better," he said, his voice stronger now. "I never want to make someone feel the way I made Juliet feel. If this is what it takes to become a better officer and a better person, then I'm willing to do it." Captain Edwards nodded approvingly. "That's a good start, Daniels. We'll work out the details of the training and community engagement program. This won't be easy, but it's necessary." Officer Daniels took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions finally settled upon him. He turned to face Juliet, his eyes filled with genuine remorse. "Juliet," he began, his voice soft and sincere, "I want to apologize to you. What I did was wrong, and I'm truly sorry for the hurt I've caused you." Juliet looked up, her eyes still wary but attentive. Officer Daniels continued, "My actions weren't just unfair to you, they were harmful. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and that's not okay. I see now how much pain I've caused, and I'm deeply sorry for that." As he spoke, his voice trembled slightly, revealing the depth of his emotion. "I want you to know that I'm committed to changing. What happened today? It's opened my eyes to how my prejudices have affected not just you, but probably many others in my career." Dr. Samuel watched his daughter closely, his protective instincts on high alert. He noticed how Juliet's expression softened slightly, though the hurt was still evident in her eyes. Officer Daniels went on, "I know words aren't enough and I have a lot of work to do. But I promise you, Juliet, I will do better. I'll work hard to confront my biases and become the kind of officer who protects and serves everyone equally." Juliet listened quietly, her gaze steady. She didn't speak, but her body language showed she was processing his words. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, though she remained guarded. Dr. Samuel observed the interaction carefully, his eyes moving between his daughter and Officer Daniels. He saw the sincerity in the officer's apology and the way Juliet was absorbing it. While he knew this moment wouldn't erase the pain of what had happened, he felt a glimmer of hope that it could be a step towards healing and change. As the meeting drew to a close, Captain Edwards stood up, his face etched with determination. He turned to Dr. Samuel, placing a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "Samuel," he said, his voice firm yet gentle, "I give you my word that I'll personally oversee Officer Daniels' participation in the racial sensitivity program. This isn't just a formality. I'll make sure he follows through and truly learns from this experience." Dr. Samuel nodded, his eyes meeting the captain's. "Thank you, John," he replied, using the captain's first name for the first time since their reunion. "I appreciate that. But understand, I'll be watching closely. This isn't just about Juliet. It's about making sure no other child goes through what she did today." Captain Edwards nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of his friend's words. "I know, and I promise you, we'll do better." Juliet sat quietly, her eyes moving between her father and the captain. Her emotions were a jumble: relief that the ordeal was over, lingering hurt from the incident, and a small spark of hope that maybe things could change. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Samuel turned to his daughter. He knelt down, meeting her at eye level. "Juliet," he said softly, "I know this has been a difficult day, but I want you to know that justice is being served. It may not feel like it right now, but what happened here today is a step in the right direction." Juliet nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I hope so, Dad," she whispered. Dr. Samuel pulled her into a tight hug, his heart aching for what she had endured. As he held her, he knew that while this meeting was a start, there was still much work to be done. The road ahead would be long, but he was determined to walk it, for Juliet and for all the children who deserved better. After a few days, Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he entered the community center for his first day of racial sensitivity training. The room was filled with faces he wasn't used to seeing, and he felt out of place in his civilian clothes. A kind-faced woman approached him, her hand outstretched. "Officer Daniels, I'm Marlene Johnson, one of the community leaders. We're glad you're here." Daniels shook her hand, nodding stiffly. "Thanks," he mumbled, unsure of what else to say. As the training began, Daniels found himself struggling to keep an open mind. The stories shared by community members about their experiences with law enforcement made him defensive at first. He wanted to argue, to explain that not all cops were like that. But as the days went by, something started to change. Daniels began to listen more and talk less. He heard stories of parents having to teach their children how to act around police to stay safe, of people being pulled over for no reason other than the color of their skin. One afternoon during a role-playing exercise, Daniels found himself in the position of a young black man being stopped by police. The fear and helplessness he felt, even in this simulated situation, shook him to his core. I never realized," he said quietly after the exercise, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't understand how it felt." Marlene patted his shoulder gently. "That's why we're here, Officer Daniels. To understand and to change." As the weeks passed, Daniels began to see the world through a different lens. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way people of color were treated in stores, the subtle microaggressions in everyday conversations. One day, while walking through the neighborhood he used to patrol, Daniels saw a group of young black boys playing basketball. His old instincts told him to be wary, to watch them closely. But then he caught himself, realizing with a jolt how deeply ingrained his biases were. The next day, as Juliet approached the school gates, her heart raced with a mix of anxiety and determination. She clutched her backpack straps tightly, taking a deep breath before stepping onto the campus. The familiar sights and sounds of her classmates chatting and laughing felt somehow different now, as if she were seeing everything through new eyes. "Juliet," a voice called out. It was her best friend, Jasmine, rushing towards her with concern etched on her face. "We heard what happened. Are you okay?" Juliet managed a small smile as Jasmine wrapped her in a tight hug. I'm getting there," she replied softly. Soon, a small group of friends gathered around her, their faces a mix of worry and anger on her behalf. They moved to a quiet corner of the schoolyard, sitting in a circle on the grass. "What exactly happened?" asked Marcus, his brow furrowed with concern. Juliet took a deep breath and began to recount her experience. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, the words pouring out like a dam had broken. She described the fear she felt when Officer Daniels approached her, the confusion and helplessness as she was handcuffed, and the anger that followed. "It was like I wasn't even a person to him," Juliet said, her voice quivering slightly. "Just because of how I look." Her friends listened intently, nodding in understanding. Some, like Marcus and Keisha, shared their own stories of racial profiling and discrimination. "It's not right," Keisha said firmly, placing a comforting hand on Juliet's shoulder. "But you're so brave for standing up and telling your story." As Juliet looked around at her friends' supportive faces, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. The fear and shame that had been weighing her down began to lift, replaced by a growing sense of empowerment. As they talked, Juliet felt a spark of hope ignite within her. She realized that her voice, joined with those of her friends and community, could be a powerful force for change. A few weeks after the incident, Dr. Samuel and Captain Edwards met at a quiet cafe downtown. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to their last encounter at the police station. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden tables. As they settled into their seats, both men seemed more relaxed, though an undercurrent of seriousness remained. Captain Edwards stirred his coffee, his eyes meeting Dr. Samuel's with a mix of determination and hope. "Sam, I wanted to update you on the changes we're implementing," Captain Edwards began. "We've started mandatory racial sensitivity training for all officers. It's not just a one-time thing either. We're making it an ongoing program." Dr. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a good start, John. But you know as well as I do that real change takes more than just training sessions." Captain Edwards leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I agree. That's why we're also revising our policies on community engagement and use of force. We're bringing in experts to help us create a more just system." "And what about accountability?" Dr. Samuel asked, his tone firm but not unkind. "How will you ensure these changes stick?" Captain Edwards sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We're implementing a new oversight committee, including community members. They'll have the power to review complaints and recommend disciplinary action." Dr. Samuel's eyes lit up with interest. "That's more like it. But John, you have to understand, this can't just be a temporary fix. Our community needs to see lasting, meaningful change." "I know, Sam," Captain Edwards replied, his voice filled with conviction. "I'm committed to this. What happened to Juliet? It opened my eyes even further. We can't let it happen again. Dr. Samuel studied his old friend's face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. He felt a glimmer of hope, but the caution born from years of disappointment still lingered. I appreciate your efforts, John, Dr. Samuel said softly. But remember, we'll be watching. Our community deserves nothing less than real, sustainable change. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Daniels took a deep breath as he stood in front of the Westside Youth Center. The brick building loomed before him, its worn facade a testament to years of community service. He hesitated for a moment, his hand on the door handle before stepping inside. The bustling energy of the center hit him immediately. Kids of all ages filled the space, their laughter and chatter echoing off the walls. As Daniels walked in, a hush fell over the room. Young eyes watched him warily, some with outright hostility. Ms. Ramirez, the center's director, greeted him with a cautious smile. Officer Daniels, welcome. The kids are just finishing up their homework time. Why don't you join them? Daniels nodded, his throat tight. He made his way to a table where a group of teenagers sat, their heads bent over textbooks. As he pulled up a chair, one boy looked up, his eyes narrowing. What are you doing here? The boy asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Daniels swallowed hard. I'm here to help, he said softly. If you'll let me. The first few weeks were tough. The kids kept their distance, their responses to his attempts at conversation curt and guarded. Daniels felt the weight of their mistrust, but he kept showing up, determined to make a difference. One afternoon, as Daniels helped a young girl with her math homework, he overheard a heated conversation nearby. A group of boys were discussing a recent encounter with the police. Their voices were filled with anger and fear. They just assumed we were up to no good, one boy said, his fists clenched. We were just walking home from the park. Daniels felt a pang of recognition. He thought of Juliet and how his own assumptions had caused so much pain. Slowly, he turned to the group. Can I hear more about what happened? He asked hesitantly. To his surprise, the boys began to talk. They shared story after story of feeling targeted, misunderstood, and afraid. Daniels listened, really listened, for the first time. He felt shame wash over him as he recognized his own past behaviors in their words. As the weeks turned into months, something began to shift. The kids started to open up more, sharing their dreams, their fears, and their everyday struggles. Daniels found himself looking forward to his time at the center, eager to learn more about the vibrant community he had once viewed with such suspicion. As the weeks passed, Juliet tried to move on from the traumatic incident with Officer Daniels. But the memories lingered, like shadows in the corners of her mind. Some nights, she'd wake up in a cold sweat, the feeling of handcuffs still ghosting around her wrists. Dr. Samuel watched his daughter with concern, noticing how she'd grow quiet at times, lost in thought. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing, he gently broached the subject. Juliet, he said softly, have you thought about sharing your story with others? Juliet looked up, surprise in her eyes. What do you mean, Dad? Dr. Samuel took her hand. Your experience, as painful as it was, could help others. It might inspire change. Juliet bit her lip, uncertainty clouding her face. I don't know, Dad. It's still hard to talk about. I understand, sweetheart, he said, squeezing her hand. Just think about it, okay? For days, Juliet mulled over her father's words. The idea of speaking publicly terrified her, but a small voice inside whispered that it might be important. Finally, after much internal debate, Juliet made her decision. She approached her father one morning, her voice trembling but determined. Dad, I want to do it. I want to share my story. Dr. Samuel beamed with pride. I'm so proud of you, Juliet. A week later, Juliet found herself standing on a small stage at a local community center. The room was packed, faces both familiar and strange looking up at her expectantly. Her hands shook as she gripped the microphone, but she took a deep breath and began to speak. As Juliet recounted her experience, her voice grew stronger. She spoke of the fear, the confusion, and the anger she felt. But she also spoke of hope, of the importance of standing up against injustice, In the audience, heads nodded in understanding. Some wiped away tears. Juliet saw other young people leaning forward, their eyes wide with recognition. As the weeks turned into months, Captain Edwards' commitment to change within the police department grew stronger. The racial sensitivity training program, once a small initiative, began to expand. More officers joined, some reluctantly at first, but many with open minds. Captain Edwards worked tirelessly to shift the department's culture. He held regular meetings with his officers, emphasizing the importance of empathy and community engagement. "We're here to protect and serve," he'd remind them, "but we can't do that effectively if we don't understand the people we're serving." The captain made it a point to lead by example. He attended community events, listened to residents' concerns, and worked to build trust between the police and the neighborhoods they patrolled. Slowly but surely, a change began to take root. Officer Daniels, true to his word, threw himself into the training program. Captain Edwards kept a close eye on him, checking in regularly to ensure his commitment wasn't wavering. "How are things going at the youth center?" Captain Edwards asked during one of their meetings. Officer Daniels smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "It's eye-opening, sir. These kids, they've been through so much. I'm learning more from them than I ever expected." Captain Edwards nodded, pleased. "And the sensitivity training?" "Challenging," Daniels admitted, "but necessary. I'm starting to see things differently now." As they talked, Captain Edwards could see the change in Daniels. The defensive posture was gone, replaced by a more thoughtful, introspective demeanor. It gave him hope that real change was possible, not just for Daniels, but for the entire department. One afternoon, Officer Daniels stood at the entrance of the youth center, watching as kids of all ages poured in after school. He'd been volunteering here for months now, and the nervous knot in his stomach that used to greet him each day had long since disappeared. In its place was a warmth he couldn't quite explain. "Hey, Officer D," a young boy called out, waving enthusiastically. Daniels smiled and waved back. "Hey there, Marcus, how was school today?" As Marcus launched into a story about his science project, Daniels listened intently. He marveled at how different this felt from his old patrol days. Back then, he might have seen Marcus as a potential troublemaker. Now, he saw a bright kid with big dreams. Later that afternoon, Daniels sat with a group of teenagers, helping them with their homework. As he explained a math problem, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. The stern, suspicious officer he once was seemed like a stranger now. "You know," one of the girls, Tasha, said suddenly, "I used to be scared of cops, but you're all right, Officer D." Her words hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. He thought of all the times he'd made people feel afraid, all because of his own biases. "I'm glad you feel that way now, Tasha," he said softly. "I'm sorry if I or any of my colleagues ever made you feel scared before." As the day wound down, Daniels found himself in a deep conversation with Mr. Santos, an elderly community leader who often visited the center. They talked about the neighborhood's history, its struggles, and its triumphs. "You've changed, Officer Daniels," Mr. Santos observed. "I remember when you first started coming here. You were different then." Daniels nodded, feeling a mix of shame and gratitude. "I was wrong before," he admitted. "I saw things in black and white, good guys and bad guys. But now I see we're all just people, trying our best." One crisp afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the youth center, Dr. Samuel and Juliet approached the youth center building with a mix of emotions. It had been months since their last encounter with Officer Daniels, and they weren't quite sure what to expect. When they entered, they found Officer Daniels surrounded by a group of children, helping them with an art project. The scene was so different from their last meeting that it took them both by surprise. Daniels looked up, his eyes widening with recognition. "Dr. Samuel Juliet," he said, his voice tinged with nervousness. "Thank you for coming." As the children dispersed for a snack break, Daniels approached the father and daughter. His posture was different now, less rigid, more open. I can't tell you how grateful I am for this chance," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "What I did was inexcusable, but it opened my eyes to my own prejudices. Being here, working with these kids, it's changing me." Juliet listened quietly, her eyes taking in the colorful artwork on the walls, the laughter of the children in the background. She could see the change in Daniels, but the memory of that day still stung. "I know words aren't enough," Daniels continued, looking directly at Juliet. "But I'm truly sorry for what I put you through. I'm working every day to be better, to make sure no one else goes through what you did." Juliet took a deep breath. "It still hurts," she said softly. "But I can see you're trying. I forgive you, Officer Daniels." Dr. Samuel watched his daughter with pride, amazed at her strength and capacity for forgiveness. He placed a hand on her shoulder, then turned to Daniels. "What you did was wrong," he said firmly. "But I can see you're making a genuine effort to change. I appreciate that. I forgive you too, but remember, this is just the beginning of your journey." The community center buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life gathered for the event. Captain Edwards stood at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. He spotted Dr. Samuel in the front row, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. "Good evening, everyone," Captain Edwards began, his voice strong and clear. "We're here today to celebrate something truly special, the power of change." The room fell silent, all eyes on the police chief. Not long ago, our community was divided. There was distrust between the police and the people we swore to protect. But today, I stand before you as living proof that change is possible. He paused, his gaze finding Dr. Samuel's. "My dear friend Dr. Samuel taught me a valuable lesson years ago. He showed me that compassion knows no color, that friendship can bridge any gap. It's because of him that I stand here today, a changed man leading a changing department." Dr. Samuel felt a lump form in his throat, touched by his friend's words. "We've made mistakes," Captain Edwards continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "But we're learning, we're growing, and most importantly, we're listening." He gestured to the crowd, where Officer Daniels sat among community members. "Forgiveness is a powerful thing. It's not easy, but it's necessary for healing. I've seen officers transform, just as I did. I've watched as they've learned to see beyond their biases and connect with the community they serve." Captain Edwards' eyes shone with unshed tears. "This journey of transformation isn't over. It's only just begun. But I stand here today, filled with hope. Hope for a future where trust replaces fear, where understanding conquers prejudice." Dr. Samuel stood up, pride swelling in his chest. He knew their efforts were making a real difference. As he joined Captain Edwards on the stage, the room erupted in applause. As the applause died down, Juliet stood up from her seat, her eyes glistening with tears. She made her way to the stage, joining her father and Captain Edwards. The three of them stood together, a powerful symbol of unity and progress. Captain Edwards placed a gentle hand on Juliet's shoulder. "Juliet," he said softly, "your bravery in sharing your story has touched so many lives. You've shown us all the importance of speaking up against injustice." Juliet smiled, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "I never thought my experience would lead to this," she said. "But I've learned that our voices matter. We can make a difference if we're brave enough to speak out." Dr. Samuel beamed with pride at his daughter's words. He looked out at the audience, his gaze landing on Officer Daniels. The man who had once arrested Juliet now sat among community members, his face a picture of remorse and determination. Officer Daniels stood up, his voice carrying across the room. "I want to thank Juliet and Dr. Samuel for their forgiveness," he said. "Their compassion has changed me. I'm committed to fighting for equality within our department and our community." The room fell silent, absorbing the weight of his words. Captain Edwards nodded approvingly, recognizing the profound change in his officer. As the event came to a close, people mingled, sharing stories and forming new connections. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal. Juliet watched as officers chatted with community members, barriers slowly crumbling. Dr. Samuel wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Look at what you've started, Juliet," he said softly. "Your courage has sparked real change." Juliet leaned into her father's embrace, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She knew there was still work to be done, but in that moment, she felt hopeful for the future. Her story had become a powerful reminder of the transformative power of understanding and forgiveness. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Daniels and Juliet, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.